Slavery, yeah, slavery was a bad thing that was to talk about.
Okay, you cannot tie imperialism and racism and slavery to just one race.
That was fitness instructor Jillian Michaels on CNN the other night, trying to make the case that we should stop being so hard on white people for benefiting from slavery.
Do you realize that only less than 2% of white Americans owned slaves?
But it was a system of white supremacy.
There is so much to break down from what Jillian had to say. So let's start off with this idea that somehow only 2% of Americans owned slaves, so that was not really that big of a deal. Now, that's accurate, but it is wildly misleading. Now, most estimates in the 1800s said that less than half of Americans even owned property, and you've got to remember that much of the country, that land that was owned wasn't even suitable for farming, for agriculture. But in the South, roughly 25% of all Southerners owned slaves, and in some states that number was as high as 50%. And those slave owners had a lot of political power. So take the state of Texas, where about 25% or so, a quarter of the population owned slaves, but they controlled 68% of the government and 73% of the wealth. And nationally, 12 of our first 18 presidents owned slaves. So slave owners were disproportionately powerful through early American history. And the idea that only 2% of Americans owned slaves, so we shouldn't make a really big deal about it, is absurd.
You realize that slavery is thousands of years old?
Actually, slavery is more than 10,000 years old, but that's beside the point, because I'm not really sure what Jillian's point is here. It's not like anyone's arguing that Americans invented slavery. We just perfected it and benefited tremendously from it and committed massive atrocities during it and perpetuated it long after it should have been eradicated, and its legacy still affects us today. Duh.
Who was the first race to try to end slavery?
I mean, I'm pretty sure it was the slaves who were trying to end slavery, but I think Jillian here is trying to give credit to some white people who pushed to end slavery. And that ignores the work of people like Harriet Tubman, who literally risked their lives freeing slaves and fighting slavery. And it also completely ignores that the reason that some white people could push back on slavery is because they weren't slaves. They were the ones in power. They had money. They had the privilege of pushing back on it. So I'm not really sure how much extra credit we get there. But that didn't stop a whole bunch of people online from rushing to Jillian's defense. Countless people who overnight became experts in, really slavery wasn't that bad. Now, in case you were wondering what sparked this entire conversation, it was this letter from the White House to the Smithsonian notifying the museum that they would be conducting an internal review. It's worth noting that the Smithsonian is historically nonpartisan. It's founded with the mission of documenting science, nature, and history truthfully, which makes some people uncomfortable because truth isn't always pretty, especially when it comes to American history. And its mission since its founding has never been to rewrite history in a way that makes you feel warm and fuzzy and comfortable about everything. And definitely its mission is not to push the narrative of American exceptionalism. But that's what this letter is asking the museum to do, to evaluate everything under this umbrella of Americanism, and to align with the president's goal of removing divisive or partisan narratives, so long as they disagree with the current partisans. You can assume that because nowhere in this letter does it mention any kind of a panel of nonpartisan, historical, or scientific experts to review the museum. Instead, it's signed by these three people: Lindsay Halligan, who is one of the president's attorneys, Vince Haley, who is a speechwriter for the president, and Russell Vought, who is a member of the administration and calls himself a Christian nationalist. He was one of the architects of Project 2025, and he has suggested that when it comes to immigration, we should prioritize letting in Christian immigrants as opposed to immigrants of any other faith. So if the goal of this letter was to rewrite American history, it is definitely mission accomplished, at least when it comes to Jillian Michaels. I think this whole thing should be sparking a couple of important conversations, one of which is the legacy of slavery in the United States and how it still affects us today. But secondly, it's why CNN was even having a fitness trainer on air in the first place to debate important issues like this. But I think when it's all said and done, out of all the things that Jillian said that night, there was one thing she absolutely was spot on about.
That's not accurate.